Welcome to the Sutherland Report. Thank you so much again for giving me the privilege of your time. One of the amazing things about doing this, as I constantly say, is the people that you meet. And you meet one person that then introduces you to another person. And then what is even more blessing about that is that when people are introducing members of their family to you. We're going to meet someone to discover about their family heritage, and what they went through during the war and then coming up to date. And the discussion will be beginning with the Holocaust and the history of that. So the person I'm going to bring on is Sam Devinki, and we'll start. Sam, lovely to meet you via the internet. Thank you so much for being incredibly patient while we've sorted out a load of technological issues. So a big shout out to your dear wife, Mary, and a huge thank you for that.
Well,
So Sam,
and thank you for having me.
Not at all. So let's just put the cards on the table in the fact that I had the joy of interviewing your second cousin, which is Rabbi Bernard Rosenberg, to give him his full title, but Ben to you. And so thank you. Ben is in New Jersey. So Sam, is it okay for you to tell us where you are right now
Sure.
in the US?
I'm in Kansas City, Missouri.
Right. Brilliant. Um, Sam, how did you end up in Kansas? Let's go back through, if we may, through some of your family history, because as we were discussing before we started the podcast, you then said that your family had come from Poland, which, of course, as we know, due to the Second World War, the border of Poland had then changed. But would you kindly take us back to that and where your family came from?
So you want me to go back to 1939?
I would love you to go back to 1939, and if you need to go back further, then please do.
No, in 1939, I had 3 grandparents. I had 9 aunts and uncles. I had probably 24 cousins. 6 years later, when the war ended in 1945, I had 1 grandparent, 1 aunt, 1 uncle, and 2 cousins. All the rest were murdered. They were either murdered by the Nazis, or actually, several of them were murdered by Poles. But the other side of that coin is that my family was also saved by a Polish Catholic gentleman and his wife. His name was Józef Gondrowicz, and he and his wife are recognized as righteous Gentiles at Yad Vashem. They saved 52 Jews. And to go through and tell you how each one of those people was murdered would take a long time. So let me just concisely try and describe it to you. When the first people they took out of Wojciech, which is where my parents were. Wojciech was a farming community 30 kilometers north of Krakow. It had about 7,000 people. Of the 7,000, 4,500 were Jews. So it was basically a Jewish town. Of those 4,500, 600 survived the war. All the rest were murdered. One of the first people taken was my grandfather, and he had actually fought in World War I as a German soldier, was wounded, and received the Iron Cross. So the question is, why would he go first? Well, the Nazis, as you know, were very methodical and very clever. A former soldier knew what a gun was. And so the first people taken from Wojciech to Treblinka, where most of them were murdered, were either ex-soldiers or teachers or rabbis or priests, because all these people were educated and could think, and therefore they could be a problem. As time went on, different members of my family were found at hiding. my grandma. I'm shortening this up because it takes too long. But my grandmother was found hiding in a basement with one of her sons and her grandchildren. She was marched out into a field with about 30 or 40 other people, and two soldiers machine gunned them and killed all of them. There were about, I think, total of about 60 people that they murdered that day. My father unfortunately witnessed this, and I got to tell you, he was never the same. My father had a split personality. He was a kind, gentle guy. He would give you the shirt off his back. But if you challenged him, if you challenged his authority, he became ballistic. And that was as a result of what happened to his mother. Because as he told me once, he said there were only two soldiers. Two soldiers killed all these people. He said we could have rushed them. And he says, some of us might have gotten killed. But what he was trying to say was maybe my mother would not have died that day. And since he survived, he thought, well, if she hadn't been murdered that day, maybe she would have survived too. Nevertheless, in September of 1942, Yuzik, why did he help my family? He was Catholic. The reason was he and my grandfather, who were taken to Treblinka, were in the same platoon in World War I. They became war buddies. And after the war, they actually went into business together. So when they took him, he told my grandfather, he said, I will do everything I can to protect your wife, which was my grandmother, and her children, which was my mother and two of my uncles. So here we are, September of 42, and Yuzik comes to my father, who wasn't my father yet, and said, tomorrow they're going to take the rest of the Jews to Treblinka. So my father goes to my mother and he says, Maria, let's get married. And she says, why should I marry you now? You've been chasing me for 2 years and I hadn't had any interest in you. What's changed? Well, and the reason for that is, as I'm sure you're aware, at that time in history, different social groups didn't mix. My father's family were business people. They were a very wealthy family in Wojcislaw. They had leather tanning company. They had cattle. They raised cattle. They had grain company. Very wealthy. My father was the youngest of 7 children, and basically never really worked a day in his life before the war. My mother's family were all rabbis, educators, shochetts, which are ritual butchers. Those two groups of people did not mix in those days. So my father says to my mother, he says, look, he says, Yuzik has told me that tomorrow they're coming to take the rest of the Jews. He has a place for us to hide. I'm a man. I can help protect you, because he knew it was just my mother and her mother and one of her sons, which was just a teenager. The other son had actually left town already. He went to Russia because they thought he'd be safer in Russia. Anyway, what Yuzik had was a root cellar. And people who are our age know what a root cellar is. It's basically a dirt hole underneath a barn. And it's where where a farmer would keep vegetables and stuff to keep them a little cooler, because there's no refrigeration in those days. So they get to this root cellar, and I actually went there in 2005. The barn was gone, but the hole in the ground was still there. And it was an area maybe 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. Not a big area. Well, 9 people, my father, my mother, my grandmother, one of my aunts, her 2 sons, and my mother's 2 brothers, and one lady who was supposedly a fiance of one of my uncles. They hid in that dirt hole for 27 months. 27 months.
Wow.
Come out during the day. You could only come out at night, because if the Nazis saw you, Jews, in this time in history also dressed different than Gentiles. So when you saw a Jew I mean, by the way he was dressed, you knew he was a Jew. So they couldn't come out during the day. Well, think about it. Living in a hole, there's no heat, there's no electricity, there's no cooling, there's no bathroom, there's no kitchen. How do you live in a dirt hole? Well, my mother told me, and everything I'm telling you is based on things my mother told me. She said we had a stream that she thought it was a quarter mile away. I don't know if she understood distances, but uh, that stream is where they got water. It's where they used for bathing, toilet things. Uh, that was their source of liquid. Food, 9 people, you got to have some food. Well, the farmer's wife would give them a loaf of bread every Friday, but it was not the bread she baked that day. It was the bread she baked the week before that was left over. And so, a loaf or two of bread doesn't feed 9 people for a week. So at night, my father and my uncles would go out and scavenger the grounds for food. Where do you find food on a farm? Well, the farmer's got to feed his pigs. So they would actually steal food from the pigs. And this is how they survived for 27 months, but not all of them survived, unfortunately. Again, it's too long to go into, but my aunt's 2 sons were both murdered. My uncle, the older of the 2 brothers, he was murdered. And what happened was in, I think, February of 1945, they started hearing airplanes go overhead, and they started hearing loud cannons. They knew something was going on. So they went to the farmer and they said, go to town and get a newspaper. We'd like to know what's going on. He says, I can't do that. He says, I can't read. If I go to town to get a paper, they'll know I'm hiding Jews. So they waited. A few more days went by. The planes got louder. The noise the cannons got louder. Finally, they couldn't stand it. They came out of the hole during the day, and the main road was maybe 150 yards from where they were hiding. They walked down to the main road, and it was like something you'd see in the movies. A column of Russian tanks was coming down the road, and that's how Wojciech was liberated. Now, just one word about the farmer. He did this for money. There's no question about it. But it also was an extremely great sacrifice, because if you're caught hiding Jews, the Nazis would not just kill you, they'd kill your whole family. So you got to give the guy credit, even though, like I say, he did it for money. So that's how the war ended for what was left of my family. But it wasn't the end of the war for my family. My grandmother went back to her house, and she also had a big house. Matter of fact, it was a compound. I've been there. It had 3 little houses around it, and she walked into the house, and there's a big Russian guy there. And he says, what are you doing here? And she said, well, it's my house. And he says, no, not your house anymore. The Russian government has given me the house. I'm the new postmaster for Wojciech. He says, if you have anything here that belongs to you, take it, but you got to go. Where do you go? Well, she went back to the ghetto where she had been during the first part of the war. And here again, Yuzik comes back into the picture, and he says to her, he says, not to her, he comes back and says to my surviving uncle from my mother's younger brother, he says, don't go home tonight. The AK, which is the Army Crimea, which was, they hated the Jews. I mean, they hated the Nazis. They fought the Nazis. They hated the Russians. They fought the Russians. But most of all, they hated Jews. But of course, Yuzik didn't hate Jews, and he was a high-ranking member of the AK. He was a colonel, I think my mother said. And the reason he didn't is because I told you he was a war buddy with my grandfather. So he says to my uncle, he says, don't go home tonight. The AK is looking for a communist that's supposedly living in that house, and it's dangerous. Well, his mother was there. He wasn't going to leave her. He went straight back there. And, of course, that night, the AK came, and they were like bullies. They started pounding on doors, beating down doors. My grandmother got scared. She told her son, his name was Shmuel, she says, climb out the back window. She didn't realize, these guys were paramilitary guys. They had the house surrounded, and this is, 1945 farm country. There's no outside lights. There's no streets. So they see this guy climbing out of a window. They figure this is the guy they're looking for. So they shot him and killed him. So then my grandmother says, we can't stay here because they'll kill us all. And the fact is, they killed Jews in Poland up until 1960. So my grandmother wanted to come to the United States. The trouble was, there wasn't a quota for Polish Jews to come to the United States in those days. My mother says, okay, and I say this tongue in cheek, she said she was born in Germany because her father had been in Germany for a couple years after World War I. He got a dispensation from the German government to sell war surplus in Hanover, Germany. So she knew all about Hanover. So she claimed she was born in Germany. Well, that made her a German Jew, not a Polish Jew. So they went from Wojciech to Regensburg, which is a DP camp, or was at that time. And, my cousin Benny was born there too. So they get to Regensburg, the end of 1945. My mother tells them she's a German Jew, and they apply for exit visas. Well, you can't get an exit visa overnight. And so in the meantime, they opened up a little haberdashery in Regensburg. 46, I was born there in that DP camp. And finally, in 1950, they got their exit visas. And HIAS, which is, the Israeli Immigration Agency, brought them to the United States. Well, here again, they wanted to go to Chicago, but all the Jews wanted to go to either New York or Chicago. And HIAS didn't want the Jews concentrated in those two places. So unless you had a job or a relative in one of those two places, HIAS picked where you went. But it's the United States. Once you get where they send you, you could go anywhere you want. There was no restriction. Well, for whatever reason, they picked Kansas City for my parents. And on the boat coming over, I developed, I can't remember the name. It's a fever that affects your heart. It's very contagious and very dangerous. And so I was put into quarantine on the boat. Well, when we got off the boat, which was at New Orleans, General Jack was the name of the boat that came over on. Matter of fact, it was even more traumatic. As they were about 3 or 4 hours outside of New York, the boat hit an iceberg and developed, not that boat, but the boat they were on hit an iceberg and developed a leak. And they actually had to transfer everybody on that boat in the middle of the ocean to General Jack. General Blackjack, I'm sorry. He was a famous American general. So they get to New Orleans and they were put on a train and sent to Kansas City. Well, they couldn't speak the language. They had managed, this is incredible, in the 4 years that they were in Regensburg, they had actually managed to save $4,000 from this haberdashery. So they came with something, that was a lot in those days. So my mother first went, and I got to tell you about my mother. My mother, to this day, and I've known a lot of highly educated people, my mother was the smartest person I've ever met. She could do numbers in her head faster than I could do them on a calculator. She had 2 years of high school. My mother had a talent that I've only met one other person, and he was a multi-billionaire who had this talent, and that was she could look at a situation and look at it today and know where it was going to end up tomorrow. It's not that she could foresee the future, but she understood. And that's something that very few people have, that kind of foresight. But here she was, strange country, strange language. She went to work as a seamstress in a high-class clothing store. My father had never worked. So he went to the Jewish Federation here, a Jewish Vocational Service, and said, I need a job. And they said, well, what can you do? And he says, what do you need? He says, well, we need a painter. And he says, okay, I'm a painter. He never touched a brush in his life. So they put him on a painting crew that was painting a building here in Kansas City that was a 22-story high-rise. And the foreman of that crew didn't like him because he was a foreigner, couldn't speak English very well, so he picked on him. So one day he tells my father, and again, this is how it was related to me by my mother. He tells my father, he says, Fred, I want you to go up to the roof there, and there's a chimney, and the chimney was 2 stories tall on a 22-story building. So I want you to paint the capstone at the top of that chimney. Well, my father knew that he was jacking him around. So basically he said to the guy, this is how my mother said it to me. He says, take the paintbrush and put it where the sun doesn't shine. So that was the end of his painting career. So then the story now is really, from here on out, the story of the American dream. My parents lived the American dream. Of course, they went through hell before they got to it, but they lived the American dream. And that story is actually on YouTube. I think it's called Devinki Real Estate. But I'll give you the short form of it. So they had this $4,000, and they bought a grocery store because that was a business that my grandmother and had been in Wojcislaw. Grocery stores this was not a supermarket. This was a little tiny grocery store. Yeah. And so they were in there for a couple years. And then the guy who owned the building comes and says, you got to move. And I said, what do you mean we got to move? What did we do wrong? Well, they didn't understand. They signed a 2-year lease, and the lease was up. And he had a tenant. He said, I have a tenant who was a dry cleaners. It was a regional chain of dry cleaners. He says, they can pay a lot more rent than you can. And so I'm going to let them have the space. Well, what do you do with a grocery store without a building? A grocery store without a building is a bunch of old fixtures. That's all it is. So they moved down we have a city market here in Kansas City. And they opened a fruit stand, which is basically, again, what they did in Europe. And by this time, one of my sisters named Karen was born. She was born in 1951. So now my mother had 2 kids, and they were basically starving to death. My mother said, I'm not going to do this. There's got to be a better way to make a living. And again, as she put it, she spoke English, but she spoke it, from her point of view, and she didn't understand all the nuances of English, but she says, there must be something better to do. She says she started looking in the paper and she sees real estate, real estate, real estate. She said, I didn't know what real estate meant. She says, but I found out. And what she found out was they bought a house. This was a turn of the century house. Okay. So even in 1954, it was already 50, 60-year-old house. And it was one of these old houses that had 3 stories. And they took that house and turned it into a 3-plex. They made an apartment on each floor. My father did the carpentry work. He did the plumbing work. My father had never plumbed anything in his life. He had to actually hire an electrician because he didn't know anything about that either. My mother did the painting. Anyway, they converted this house into a 3 units. So one day she's down at the city market there in her fruit stand. And this guy calls up and says, Mrs. Devinki, my name's, I don't know, Joe Blow, okay? He says, I can't remember his name, but he says, I'm the executive vice president for Kansas City Life, which is a big insurance company here in Kansas City. He says, we want to buy your house. Well, I got to back up. They paid $7,000 for that house, okay? Now, they didn't have 7,000 pennies at this point. What they did was they borrowed $2,000 from a cousin in New York who had come a couple years before them and was already a foreman in a women's factory that made clothes. And so they borrowed $2,000 from him. Across the street from the fruit stand was a bank called Merchants Produce Bank. A guy named Sam Schultz owned it. Sam was an American, but he spoke Yiddish. So my mother goes over there and says, I need to borrow $5,000 to buy this house. And Sam says, okay, now they're talking Yiddish, not English, okay? He says to her, what do you have for collateral? My mother says, what's collateral? She had no idea what that meant. He says, something to back up this loan. So she says she opened her coat and she says, I'm your collateral. And she said, Sam started laughing and he loaned her the $5,000. So they bought this house for $7,000. So now here we are, less than 6 months later, this guy from Kansas City Life calls and says, I want to buy the house. Well, she hung up on him because where she came from, buy really meant take. Okay. So a couple of days go by and this guy comes down to the fruit stand. He's in his 3-piece suit. You didn't see guys like that down in the fruit market. And he says, Mr. Devinki, I don't think you understood. He says, I'm the vice president of real estate for Kansas City Live. We're going to buy that whole block. We're going to tear it down, make a parking lot for Kansas City Live. He says, we know you paid $7,000. We're going to give you $12,000. Well, $5,000 in 1954 was, again, serious money. So they did that. And he says, if you want to buy something else, we'll help you find something. Well, before they even closed that deal, about 3 blocks from there was 4 fourplexes, 16 units. And with this $5,000 profit, that was enough down payment. And Kansas City Life gave him the mortgage because now he could see my mother knew what she was doing. So they bought these 4 fourplexes. Here again, less than a year went by, and a company out of New York called Union Life calls my mother, or got in touch with her somehow, and said, we want to buy the whole block because we're going to tear it down and we're going to build our regional headquarters there. So again, my mother was brilliant, but nobody succeeds without a little bit of luck. So that deal, those 16 units, and by the way, the building they built is still there. It's now the Kansas City Housing Authority. But with those 2 deals, they started a company called Devinki Real Estate. And Devinki Real Estate, during their lifetime, became a pretty good size local company. I mean, we're not national by any means, but at one time and back in the 90s, we had 2,500 apartment units. So you can see what developed from a house with 3 units. And some of it's luck, but some of it's also she had this incredible ability. She bought 3 buildings on the Plaza, Country Club Plaza, which is a very fancy district here. She bought 3 buildings out of an estate. She sold one of those buildings before they even closed on it. And she sold the one she sold was enough to pay for the 2 that she kept. That's what kind of business person she was. And like I say, they created the American dream for myself and my 2 sisters. I don't know how to tell you anymore it's a miracle. In some sense, it's a miracle, but it's because she had this incredible ability. And like I say, if you ever want to watch the story as she tells it, because we did it, it was about a 20-minute video we did for her 85th birthday back in 2005. And you can hear the story and illustrations and pictures and stuff from her point of view. It's called Devinki Real Estate.
I would be delighted to do that. And at this point, I just want to take you back to Poland, and I do apologize if I'm not getting the pronunciation right. But when you're talking about where your family came from, are you talking about Wrocław in southern Poland?
Wojciech.
Now, how do you spell that? WJ?
The WOD.
Right. Okay.
There are actually two Wojciechow's in Poland.
Right.
Uh, and I think the one you're talking about is not where they came from.
No.
No,
I've
they there there's a main road that goes from Krakow to Warsaw. Okay, Wojciech is 30 miles or 30 kilometers north of Krakow, right on that main road. It's still
in
it's still there today. I've been there several times.
when in 1986 I was in Poland before the wall came down, which another experience that you don't forget. And then I visited Auschwitz, so I'm sort of going back there in regard to memory and experiencing that. But when you're describing this hole in the ground, you actually went back to Poland. Then you went back to there, found that hole, but the building wasn't there. How big was that hole again? Where your
It
family?
was 15, 20 feet wide and maybe 20, 30 feet long. I mean, it's the size of a small barn. You know how small barn. And well, like I said, there's a lot of detail I didn't give you. But
No.
we spoke to a gentleman who was in his late 60s at the time.
Hmm.
And he was the son of the farmer who hid my parents.
Wow.
And he was 6 years old at the time of the war. And he knew that his father had hidden Jews. And he told me stories that matched up with the stories that my mother told me. So, when you're researching history, when you hear it from both sides, you're getting the real facts.
I mean, how sorry if it sounds a very stupid way to describe it, but I then want to, how did that feel actually meeting him and cross-referencing these stories? It must have been quite
Well,
incredible, really, very emotional.
I was very grateful to meet him.
Mm.
Yes. It was, just to know that he was part of the family that saved my parents was an incredible thing. Plus, I also have met the children of Josip Gondrovich, and his children. One of them when I met them, was a retired engineer that worked for the state, and the other was a renowned surgeon. Both very intelligent people.
You made a comment earlier where you said that Jews were being killed in Poland right up to 1960. Can you expand on that?
I really can't because I never looked into it, other than it's something that's been told to me both by my mother and by other people. See, I've been involved with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum
Mm.
for 34 years, since the day they opened, actually. And so, I've gotten information from sources at the museum, but to give you specifics, I don't have any.
Right, right. I was just picking up your comment about Yad Vashem. I was there in May a few months ago, um, which is an incredible memorial, and the way the whole thing is set out and explained is is phenomenal in the way that's laid out. So, Sam, you've been involved with the Holocaust Memorial for Society for 34 years. Excuse my ignorance. Where is that based in the US?
It's in Washington, D.C., and I sat on what they call the council. The council is a group of 55 people that are all appointed by the President of the United States. My first appointment was with President Bush, was in 2003. Unfortunately, those appointments are somewhat political. So if you're a Republican, only a Republican president's going to appoint you. If you're a Democrat, only a Democratic president or Democrat president's going to appoint you. So my first appointment was President Bush in 2003, when my in their 5-year appointments. When my appointment came up at the end of 5 years, of course, Barack Obama was president, and so he chose not to reappoint me, which it's fine. That I expected that. Then, when President Trump came into office in 2018, actually came into office in 16, but he appointed me again in 18, and again, my appointment ran out in December of 2024. So President Bush, President Obama,
Biden.
Thank you. President Biden was, and of course, he didn't reappoint me. So I've asked President Trump for a reappointment. They're, like I say, they're very political. I'm not basically a political guy. I'm interested in Holocaust education and Holocaust remembrance. So whether I will ever get reappointed, I don't know, but that I will still support the museum and I still work for the museum. And in fact, I'm going to Germany in about a week from tomorrow, actually, with the museum. We're going to Berlin and to Munich.
Right.
When you get old, you forget stuff.
Don't worry, you're not old and you're doing brilliantly. So thank you.
We're going to Munich and Berlin to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. I've been on some fantastic trips with the museum. 2 years ago, I got to go to the Vatican. We had a private audience with the Pope. And I've been to almost, I think, every country in Europe where the Holocaust existed. I've been there. I've been to all the death camps. I don't know if that's anything to be excited about, but it's a fact. And so it's been quite an experience being involved with the museum.
Going back to your mother, and this is when I was chatting with Bernard. He talked about a point in history where his mum and dad felt that they could begin to talk about what they've been through. So within your own family, with your parents, was the Holocaust discussed? Was what they went through talked about with you?
I'll tell you how that happened. My father hardly ever said anything.
Right.
Once in a while, he'd give us a little tidbit here and there. My mother never talked about it until one day we went to an event at the Holocaust Museum, and there were 2,000 survivors there. And my mother heard these survivors telling their stories, and it like opened a lid for her, and everything started coming out about the Holocaust. But I was already 50 years old by then, and I guess she felt more comfortable talking about it. But up until then, we didn't know much about what happened, and by then it was already kind of late. My father passed away shortly after that. My mother was she was already in her 80s. Her memory wasn't as good as I would have liked it to have been, but we did the best we could.
I mean, I'm just going to find it. I showed you this incredible book by Martin Gilbert, where the Holocaust, the Jewish tragedy, by Martin Gilbert. But the comment that Martin Gilbert makes in that is he talks about, I think it wasn't until, which in some ways is hard to believe, really, but films like Schindler's List coming out, then opened up. I think that was 1993. Then opened up the discussion of the Holocaust, and I just wondered if you identify with that. You've just talked about parents not talking about it, but I just wondered if you then identify with that, because that must have opened up other opportunities, maybe to go into schools, etc.
I don't know about Schindler's List. The thing that I sort of identified with more was, remember the movie about the Bilski brothers? They were in, I think, Lithuania, and they were a resistance group, and they at one point had over 2,000 people in their group. They hid out in the forest there.
Yeah. I do know the film you mean.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I've actually been in that forest where they were, and and I talked to one woman who was with them. She was in her 90s when I spoke to her, and she told me how they had to live and so forth, and that kind of brought me back to my parents. But uh, Schindler's List was my parents were never in a concentration camp. They were in a ghetto, but never in a concentration camp. So, and that's why the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education uses me a lot, because my family story is different than the average story that most survivors have.
Your story is incredible, and I'm just going to say this. So, and your memory, and I'm assuming that you have written, of course, written a load of this down, that you've documented all this because of the trips you've made, etc.
Some of it, yes. Yeah. About 20 years ago, I wrote a 50-page uh, sort of autobiography about my my experience with my growing up and with my parents, but I haven't done much with it since then.
Well, I would like to urge you to do that when you find that moment, because it's so important that you do. Any family history, um, for anyone, is really really important, but particularly with yours in this case, and particularly with what we're now seeing playing out. Um, Sam, we're in the last sort of 10 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, and I wanna pivot a bit, if I may, to to join what you talked about, history. It's history. It's real, and then pivot to where we are now with what we are seeing after the attack on the 7th of October 2023 on October in Israel, and the the rise in anti-Semitism that we're seeing across the world, but addressing what has been going on in America. We think of Columbia University, etc. Um, just what are your thoughts? Because this
Well,
this must this must bring up.
I have a couple thoughts. I have a couple thoughts.
Mm,
Uh, First of all, in the mid 1970s, about 50 years ago, one day I was in the office with my mother, and we talked about Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Whenever there was something that happened, and she said to me, "Remember, 50 years ago," she says, "You wait." These were her exact words as I remember them. She says, "You wait. What happened in Germany will someday happen in this country." And I said, "They're not going to put people in ovens here." And, David Duke was big at those days. She says, "No, I know. It won't be like that, but it'll be the same type of thing." Now, she saw that 50 years ago, and now I see it happening. To me, what's going on in this country now is shocking, but not surprising. Does that make any sense? And
yes, and when you say David Duke, are you referring to the KKK?
yes,
Right.
um, little did we know 50 years ago that it would not be the KKK that we need to worry about, but
Mm,
that we need to worry about Hamas
yeah.
and fundamentalists. But the point is, it's scary to me how easily the American public is swayed by propaganda.
Mm.
Okay, and um, uh, you know, I do everything I can to disseminate Holocaust education. But when I see what's going on in the universities, it makes me feel like what I'm doing is really of no effect at all. Uh, and it's like I said, it's scary. I don't know that I can do anything any different. I will keep talking to anyone who will listen. Um, but the people who are at Columbia and Harvard and those places, you can't educate them. They don't want to be educated. They already have made up their minds. where we have to do the education is in the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And what's happened, unfortunately, is the Jews in this country, as well as the true Americans in this country, went to sleep 20 years ago. And they let the universities be overtaken by this radical thinking. And you can't turn that around in a year or two. It took 20 years to get us where we are. It may take another 20 years if we can ever turn it around. I don't know. But, I have friends who are a little bit nuts. They say, well, we're going to move to Canada. I have cousins in Canada. Let me tell you, it's not much better there. Or they're going to go to Israel, which is okay. I encourage them to go to Israel. But I think that Israel is like an insurance policy for American Jews. As long as we have Israel, there's always someplace that we can go. And for some reason, I think if I were in Israel, I'd feel safe. Now, I love this country, and I'm not going to leave it, regardless, especially at my age. But I have kids, and I have grandkids, and I worry about them. But again, as long as Israel is strong, I feel I've got an insurance policy.
I hear you. I mean, and in America, and in the UK, no matter what you see on the screens, and in other countries in Europe, there are many people that support the Jewish people, that support Israel. We stand with you, and I'll just say this as a Christian, a Bible believing Christian, that is a commandment. But I do that out of love and the expression of my faith and understanding. So, but there are many people that do. But I hear you in regard to when Bernard was talking about what he has had to suffer within the education establishments, and then of course with what's happening in New York with Mamdani, and he is not the only one. There are some very serious issues that are happening in Texas as well that people are going to have to deal with. But yeah, sorry, Sam.
No, but that's exactly what I was getting ready to tell you. What's going on the campuses is one thing. Those are a bunch of radicals. But what is much more scary to me is that it's creeping into government. And, if you have Jew haters on campus, that's one thing. But if you have Jew haters in the United States Congress, that's a much more terrifying thing, because, Germany could not have been overtaken by the Nazis unless they controlled the government. And this is the part that really concerns me.
Well, we've got a left-wing ideology, and as you already made that comment about your family that are living in Canada, we then look at the fact there's been awful marches, happening in Toronto, Ottawa, etc. We look at the fact that Carney has turned around and said that he will recognise a two-state, the state of Palestine that doesn't exist, and then the UK Prime Minister said the same to try and stop this war. Then we look at France, and then we look at Albanese. All of those governments are of a left-wing ideology, and also, as we know through history, and including recent history, if we look at what happened with Iran, is the fact that the extreme left and the Marxists then get together with Islam, and that is historical fact. That's what's playing out.
And it just goes to show you, in my opinion, how bad things have gotten. If these European countries who suffered under the Nazis can now say that they're going to recognize a Palestinian state, what are they thinking? don't they understand that by recognizing a Palestinian state, they don't solve the problem, they just make it worse?
Well, I mean, looking at French history under the Vichy government, and how many Jews were then sent from France to death camps, is a subject that needs to be talked about. And no, you are absolutely right. And then going back to the universities, is looking back at their history in the 30s, and looking at particular universities then taking great pride by I think Nicholas Murray Butler, who then was one of the chancellors there, and taking great pride in lowering the percentage of Jewish students that were allowed into the particular university that he was overseeing. And this is historical fact, and people need to look at that when they're also the fact that they were inviting Nazis over to then come and speak at particular universities. This is, we can go back to eugenics and where that was birthed. So all of that, Sam. But I want to encourage you to keep going, and to keep going into schools and keep having this conversation. Is one of the privilege of sitting down here with you now and having this conversation. And by all means, when we can spread the word through this discussion just on this podcast, because that's important. Sorry, Sam, I apologize.
No, I was just going to say, again, I appreciate you giving me the time to express my thoughts, and I will. I'm going to continue as long as I can. I just sometimes worry about how much good I'm actually doing, if any. But let me just say this, and this is how I end with my students. I tell them, you are living in the greatest country, and I know you're in England, but I can't help it.
Yeah.
I believe the United States is the greatest country in the world. And most of the people in this country right now, I shouldn't say most, many of the people in this country right now don't appreciate and understand what a wonderful and terrific country this is, because you couldn't protest like this in almost 90% of the countries in the world. You couldn't have the freedom that you have in this country in 90% of the world. And they just don't appreciate it. And unfortunately, they won't appreciate it until it's too late.
And I completely concur. And I have many friends on your side of the pond. And sometimes not necessarily friends, but with other people, when I feel as though I've been shouting for a long time with people to wake up. And also, I would say this, Sam, is to not forget the rest of us that are outside the US, that are also passionate about their own countries, but are passionate about freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and what that actually means. But no, it's not very easy when you've got people within the United States of America that have no understanding of the Constitution, no understanding of how America came about, the founding fathers. And I'm not sure if it was Benjamin Franklin, but when a lady said to him, what have we got, when the founding fathers eventually coming up with the Constitution of 1787, and then turning around and saying, well, you have a republic if you can keep it, ma'am. And that's where you're at. That is where you're at. And the American dream, you're right, the American dream for many generations has been real. But the worry is maybe it has been tarnished. And it's like over here as well, where people think that socialism is the answer. And no, it isn't. I'll just put my political 2 pennies worth on the table there, Sam.
And again, I told you, I believe in the American dream because I've actually lived it through my parents. And so, it disturbs me greatly that it may not be available to the next generation.
I hear you. Sam, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your story. You are right. I could act, and to be honest, I know you've skated over things. I'd love to be able to do this again. There are many things that we need to then talk about. But all I want to encourage you again is to keep going, educating people in schools to write things down, go back to that 50-page and expand that. And then when you've written it, I'll come to you and say, can I have the movie rights, please? That'd be great. It sounds incredible, an incredible story that needs to be made. And they are, because they're personal. And then when you meet someone who is relaying this history, it's very powerful. Sam, I'm going to play us out. Stay with me over the other side, and I'll say goodbye to yourself and your dear wife. And as I say, thank you so much for sitting down with me and having this conversation.
My pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity.
Not at all.